Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's your host Weeb Union, and we start out here to the west of Donetsk, where there has been three separate advances by the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance a significant portion and break through the Ukrainian defenses in Pervomaiske, capturing 1 square kilometer of territory. The same was the south of Novelske, where the Russians have infiltrated some Ukrainian fortifications and trench networks by the 2014 line of defense of the Ukrainians. After an assault towards these positions, the Russians have covered another 1 square kilometer of territory. In the direction of Heorhiivka, the Russians have captured about half a square kilometer of territory within the village itself. So we're seeing three significant advances by the Russians here to the west of Donetsk. And we start out here in the direction of Pervomaiske, where the Russians have managed to gain control over the central parts of the town, leaving only the western parts remaining in Ukrainian hands. There's no significant fortifications within Pervomaiske left. As such, the Russians will likely push the Ukrainians completely out of the town in coming days or the next week or so, as the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw from these positions due to the lack of fortifications. The fighting in the town of Pervomaiske is very significant, as the Russians have been pressuring the Ukrainians hardly throughout the period of March. We see that the advances the Russians have made into town started on the 4th of March, continued on the 7th. On the 11th to 13th, we had a Russian offensive in the area, allowing them to break through the fortifications by flanking it from the north. At that point, they managed to gain significant advances to the east. Now the Russians have broken through the Ukrainian fortifications completely and gained control over the central parts of the town. It'll be interesting to see if the Ukrainians will be able to establish positions further down within the town, or if they'll be forced to withdraw completely to Netailove, as the Russians will continue pressuring the Ukrainian positions. But with this, the Ukrainian fortifications here in the central parts between Novelske and Pervomaiske are in further danger due to the encroaching the Russian army pushing through the flanks of it. We also see here to the south of Novelske, we see that the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in their fortifications here to the south of Novelske. We see that with this, the Russians have gotten their first foothold within the fortifications here, which are by the Ukrainian 2014 lines of defense, which spans through the eastern parts of Krasnohorivka and to the north. And with this, the Russians are attacking the northern flank of Krasnohorivka. It was evident once they captured Novelske that they would be looking to push towards the northern flank of Krasnohorivka. However, we do see that the northeast here has significant fortifications compared to a further and wider flank, which would avoid and bypass the majority of these fortifications. Instead, we're seeing the Russians pushing through them by launching this attack and gaining a foothold within it. It is likely that the Russians will try to gain full control of it before the Ukrainians manage to launch a counterattack, pushing them out of it. And with that, we see some intense fighting taking place here to the south of Novelske. This is likely to secure the southern flank of Novelske and allow them to push further westwards from these positions and continue the flanking maneuver or pincer maneuver of the Ukrainian fortifications in between Pervomaiske and Novelske to gain control over the northern area, and subsequently allow them to then continue pushing here in the direction of Krasnohorivka. Further south, we see here in the direction of Heorhiivka, the Russians have managed to gain control over the central parts of the village as the Russian pressure continues towards the town of Heorhiivka. And with this, it is likely that the Russians will be able to completely push out the Ukrainians from this village as well, similar to Pervomaiske, with this breakthrough of the Ukrainian fortifications, allowing the Russians to gain a foothold within the central parts of the town. If the Russians gain control over Heorhiivka, they can gain full control over the river line here to the south of Krasnohorivka and creating a strong flank for a push towards Krasnohorivka itself from the southern direction. It could also start the fighting over Maximilianivka here to the west of Heorhiivka and lead to a Russian flanking maneuver of Krasnohorivka, attacking it from the rear and cutting off the main supply route, which is the rail route here to the west of Krasnohorivka. We're seeing that the Russians are heavily pressuring the Ukrainian positions here to the west of Donetsk. It is likely that their goal is to gain control over Krasnohorivka, the southern flank of Donetsk to the west of Marinka and Pobieda, and the directly western flank of Donetsk through pushing through Pervomaiske towards Netailove, capturing Netailove, getting a position by the river line or the reservoir area and gaining full control over the fields here in the area. This would allow the Russians to gain full control over the western parts of Donetsk and pretty much completely get rid of any artillery threat towards Donetsk itself, so that the Russians can start building up this city as a main supply hub for a future massive offensive that goes through the Donetsk region itself. The Russians in such a situation would start to develop an offensive operation towards Pokrovsk that would mainly go through the west of Heorhiivka, through Ocheredzine, and the railways through to Pokrovsk, from the west of Donetsk through Pervomaiske, and through the highways directly towards Pokrovsk through Netailove, and in the south by Marinka westwards to gain the control over the southern flank towards Pokrovsk. We see that the Ukrainian fortifications are built in a style that sort of predicts the Ukrainian tactics when it comes to the defense, and we see based on this that the Ukrainian fortifications here to the south of Pokrovsk are all facing in a southern direction. They're all to defend against the south of Pokrovsk, which means that the Russians may be looking to push through the Ukrainian fortifications here by Heorhiivka, flank the Ukrainian positions by Volodar, and push through to Velika Novosilka and gain control over the southern parts of these fortifications, as the Ukrainians would not be able to properly defend in an eastern direction, as they put a lot of efforts on the defense of these cities of Marinka, Krasnodarivka, etc., rather than building fortifications in that direction, as they were expecting the Russians to push through from the southern direction following the capture of Mariupol in the early section of the war. We see that the main part of the fortifications are centered around a southern direction, facing that direction, which leaves the eastern flank vulnerable. This is why the fortifications by Konstantinivka and Novomikhailivka are significant, because those are the toughest fortifications in an eastern direction by the Ukrainians on the Russian positions. And we can't talk about the upcoming Russian offensive without talking about the missile strikes on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. We have seen over the past few days significant destruction of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Strikes such as this one, where we see a massive explosion in the background, followed by another one as the Russians strike these energy infrastructure, hydroelectric power plants and other power plants, which subsequently has left 4 Ukrainian regions on emergency power. The regions of Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kropyvnytsky, and Kharkiv are all currently running on emergency power, which are the 3 regions here by the front line. Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv are all here by the front line, which would be an immediate target in case of a Russian offensive. The impacts of the power on the Ukrainian energy industry has the effect that the Ukrainians would not have any war industry that can run without power. They need power to run their military industry. At the same time, this would also affect the Ukrainian logistics, as 90% of the reserves of the Ukrainians are transported by rail, and rail in Ukraine needs power. Finally, there was someone in my Telegram chat who mentioned this point, and another possibility to these strikes is to force or urge the Ukrainians to seek refuge out of Ukraine. If there's no power within Ukraine, then most jobs and significant portion of the economy will gain a massive hit, which will force a lot of Ukrainians to simply flee as refugees, whether it is to completely avoid the war or the impact of the war, of the effects of the war. The current situation is not sustainable for the Ukrainian population. If they cannot work, they do not have money. Without money, they don't have food. They cannot provide for their family. They cannot secure their homes, etc. So it's a very terrible situation to be in if the power is out. The benefit this would provide to the Russian army is, in case the majority of the citizens leave Kharkiv, then the Russian army in an assault or as offensive towards Kharkiv would be able to siege it heavily, bombard it heavily, without the care for civilian casualties. it would be to push the Ukrainian civilians out so that fighting can take place within these cities. So it makes sense for the areas to be hit and to run on emergency power right now to be Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and the area here to the west. But with this, we see that there is constant destruction of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. This is also massive hits in the Odessa direction, Kiev and Lviv directions, as well as the gas reserve of the Ukrainians being hit, which also has a significant effect on the emergency power because it runs on gas. So based on all of this, we can say that it is clearly a pre-offensive missile campaign, as they are hitting areas that has a direct effect on the upcoming Russian offensive. We also see strikes on the Ukrainian military industry and Ukrainian air defense. If the Russians completely destroy the Ukrainian air defense, their own army would gain air supremacy, allowing the Russian planes to fly freely around in the Ukrainian airspace. This would give a significant advantage to the Russians fighting in Ukraine. So there are many points and many targets that are directly beneficial to the upcoming Russian offensive. Therefore, I would estimate and assume that this missile campaign has the goal of preparing this Russian summer offensive. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon.